So, good morning, Rouzbeh. Thank you very much for coming onto the DiploStack podcast this morning, calling in from Brussels, and we're in Paris at the moment. We're going to talk about the recent conflict in Iran. Israel and the United States attacked Iran on Friday, the 13th of June, and there was a 12-day conflict, which just recently, well, ended for the moment at least. So thanks a lot. We've had you on the program before, but perhaps before we get into it, just give us an update of what you're up to these days, and then we'll get started onto it.
Well, I've primarily reverted back to university, so I'm an adjunct senior lecturer at Lund University, which is, the original crime scenes, as it were, back in the day.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, great to hear that. So I wanted to start. I mean, there's just so much has happened in the last 12 days. It's really shattered I guess, the status quo completely. What actually happened? And people are still trying to decipher what happened exactly. But first, I want to say what happened before. I think people don't talk much about it in the news I've seen. What was actually happening in the lead up? And perhaps just talking a bit about the context. I mean, it's obviously the revolution in Iran happened in 1979, a long time ago, but that broader context and more very recently the negotiations were happening. Could we start there on what the state of play was?
Well, I'll try and put it in very simple terms. You can say that Iran and the US have been enemies since 1979, 80. And most of the time, when one side had wanted to reach out, the other side had rejected that proposal. So basically, the only time when both sides were in sync was when President Obama was in the United States and during his second term realized that everything they tried before, which was pressure through sanctions, threats of war, etc., could not get the Iranians to give up their nuclear enrichment program.
Right,
So he decided to change tack and actually try something different, to negotiate and not have zero enrichment as the precursor or the prerequisite for
right.
those negotiations. And that kind of opened up things a lot. And so in 2013, they started to negotiate in earnest and
Yeah.
very quickly reached a temporary deal. And then that took another year or so of negotiations to become a permanent agreement, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
The famous JCPOA. Yeah.
Yes. And the JCPOA came into power in January 2016. And the
Yes.
problem then, of course, was that the United States had a new president, President Trump,
Right.
who then spent 2 years, more or less, pontificating about whether this was such a bad deal that he should leave it publicly.
Yeah.
And in the end, he did in May 2018.
Yes.
And so you can say that for those 2 years, the agreement worked very well. The Iranian nuclear program was boxed in, it was curtailed, and it was surveilled.
So
Uh,
effectively, the enrichment, the amount that could be enriched was very limited. Is that right? And it was all
yes,
under high visibility, etc. So it
yes.
sounds like the deal was working. Yeah.
It was very much, and at least from the non-proliferation side, it was
Yeah.
working quite well. It was considered to maybe be a new gold standard for how to, box these kind of things in. Problem was, of course, that Trump, just even before he left, had through his, open pontifications about how bad the deal was, scared off everyone who wanted to invest in Iran. So that
Yeah.
was a problem. And then when he left the deal, he reinserted all US sanctions, which
Yes.
meant that Iran's primary incentive, the economic dividends coming from trading with the
Right.
Europeans, died off.
So that's the I guess from the Iranian perspective, the reason why they'd accept the boxing in of their program was effectively we're going to turbocharge the economy because we're not going to have sanctions. We can do business with Europe, etc. But
Yeah.
that was pulled out. So that was just unilaterally killed.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the secondary US sanctions basically scared off the Europeans. And
Yeah.
so the Iranians waited a year roughly for the Europeans to kind of try and make up for this because everyone else was still in the deal. So
Yeah.
in legal sense, it's still valid. And Europe could not because you can't force European companies to give up the American market for the very much smaller Iranian market.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then the Iranians started to play hardball themselves. So they did what they call less for less. They started to
Ah,
basically divert from the agreement their own commitments to the agreement step by step to increase the pressure on the US and on
right.
Europe. Now, that didn't work, other than, of course, to scare both the Europeans and the Americans into thinking that the Iranians are potentially moving slowly but steadily towards the kind of enrichment levels that will let them then weaponize their
Yeah.
program.
Yeah.
And so Biden came in, and Biden had promised as a candidate to go back to the agreement. He didn't do that because when you're in DC, you think you're the center of the world. So his team thought they could extract more concessions from the Iranians
Right.
because Trump sanctions were still in play.
Yes.
And that did not happen
Yes.
because anyone who's followed the Iranians would tell you that they don't really buckle.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they just increased their enrichment levels.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's how we ended up with having 60% enrichment levels in Iran,
Yeah.
which, can't be really justified for anything.
So just on that, so what were the enrichment levels under the JCPOA? What do we remember what sort of levels we were at back in 2015, 16? Yeah.
So you need 3.67
Yeah.
for your standard nuclear power station, and you
Right.
need roughly 20% for most kinds of cancer treatment.
Right. Okay.
So those were,
So,
3.67 was the main, and then
yeah.
you controlled how many kilos there were. And as soon as they went beyond that, it was shipped out.
Right. Oh,
Okay. So there
okay.
was a minimum and a maximum, if you will, on that stuff.
So back then they were well within those limits effectively
Yes.
under the JCPOA. Yeah. So
Yes. As
yeah.
soon as it got over that, it was shipped out, I believe, to Russia to be made into fuel rods. So remaking them to use them for weapons would be very, very difficult.
Okay. Okay. So
So
it was working effectively for non-proliferation purposes. The
yes.
JCPOA was working. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Trump had decided because Obama signed the deal, he was against it. So he left it. And then Biden didn't go back to it because he was too clever by half. And the Iranians were fooling around as well. So we end up in a situation where they enrich at a level that can't really be justified except as political pressure. But
Yeah.
of course, if you are suspicious of their intentions, it tells you that they are several crucial steps closer to enriching to 90%, which is what you need for a nuclear weapon.
A weapon. Okay.
Yeah. And so when Trump comes back now,
Yeah.
this is one of the issues that he now needs to solve. He wants to solve and get credit for it, even though he created the problem himself. And so they start to negotiate. And we see in those negotiations how complicated things are on the American side, which is that his White House is divided. You have those who come from the MAGA camp, who are
Yeah.
not interested in more war in the Middle East, and so who believe that it's possible to go get a deal. It potentially
Yeah.
will be better than Obama's deal, but most crucially, it will have to accept that there is enrichment in Iran.
Yes. But they've said, have they accepted that or not? I thought that, yeah.
So Witkoff, who is the negotiator, who has no experience of these things from before, but is a personal friend of Donald Trump and therefore has his confidence,
Yeah.
agreed on that from what we know in
Yeah.
those first rounds of negotiations. And then when he went back, the other camp, the neocons, who are
Yeah.
also part of this White House, basically got Donald Trump to turn 180 degrees and
Yeah.
demand that there will be absolutely no enrichment in Iran. In
Right.
fact, then they went further and basically, wanted Iran to give up its missile program as well, which is the only deterrence Iran has. So
Yes.
you went from something that looked feasible as a starting point, at least, because no one was demanding 100% from the other side, to something that became very quickly, in my opinion, a poison pill. I mean, it wasn't
Right.
really a serious negotiation position because you knew beforehand that it wasn't
Not going
going
to
to
work.
fly.
Right.
Yeah. And
And
in that situation, then Israel inserts itself.
okay. So that's when that happened. But just before in the lead up just before, like in the month or two before, I thought there was some progress or the negotiations were actually at least constructive. They were described, I think, once or twice as constructive by various parties. So it's not as though they'd broken down at all, negotiations in the
No,
lead up.
no, no, no. I mean, from what we know, Witkoff, who doesn't have the same kind of team as the Iranians,
Yeah.
because they haven't really tapped into all the expertise that exists in the American bureaucracy,
Yeah.
was making progress, and the ambiance was good. So
Right.
it wasn't like two enemies in that sense meeting and with daggers out. But again, he had to go home and get clearance for the things that he had discussed, just like
Right.
the Iranians, which is
Yeah.
just what Kerry and Zarif did during the
Yeah.
negotiations leading up to JCPOA. Here is one of the structural deficiencies of the Trump presidency. They don't really tap into or use their own bureaucracy.
Right.
Okay.
So all
So
the
there is no
expertise
team.
that
It,
exists.
it's very, Yeah, it's very personalized. So,
Yes.
it's a guy who knows a guy and two of his guys. And that, it works to break the ice. But if you want an actual deal on something as complicated as a nuclear enrichment program with a country like Iran, you're going to have to get into the details and the nitty-gritty. They
Yeah.
never got to that point because
Yeah.
they pivoted on their own negotiation position from something that was doable to something that was very maximalistic.
Yes.
And then the Israelis inserted
Yeah.
themselves and
With
initiated a war with so
yeah. So let's move on to that. I mean, was there any indications that Israel would attack out of the blue like that? Because it really was a strike out of the blue on Friday, the 13th of June.
well, you can say that the noise for it had been building up throughout March, April, May. So if you, as I did, talk to various parties
Mm,
in Europe, it was clear that many were worried
mm,
that the Israelis were going to do something. And so, on the one hand, everyone wanted Donald Trump to move quickly and start securing something that looks like a deal. On the
mm,
other hand, no one in Europe trusted him to know the details so that
yeah.
whatever he secured was actually good enough from a
Yeah.
European perspective and non-proliferation.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
very ambivalent. And the fact that the negotiations did not progress immediately into something that was, stable enough because the Americans changed their position.
Yes.
Um, you could say that the Israelis decided that now was the best opportunity because they could argue to Donald Trump that you're not making any headway. The Iranians are trying to fool you. And so, in that sense, the ship has
There was
sailed, and now we need to go into a
okay
kind of
in that
more
that way, but
military
I mean.
solution.
But I mean, there hasn't. This is unprecedented. Obviously, it's an act of war, and under Biden or previous, even Trump 1.0, it might have been unimaginable that this happened, right? So it was really a strike from the blue. Though you do say the context was. I mean, I believe there's been talk of striking Iran. Israel's been talking about this for decades, since the 1990s, and it's not the first time. So
No, but I think that the difference of the context is that they've already kind of outmaneuvered Hezbollah. And they
yes,
had already in the previous tit for tat in the last
yeah,
year destroyed, from their point of view, all the relevant air defense systems that
yeah,
would, otherwise potentially be a bother for them. So in that sense, they argued to Trump and to the world basically that,
yeah,
the military solution is not as complicated
right,
as it would have
yeah.
looked 5 years ago or even 3 years ago.
Yeah, and Syria, of course, a big
Yeah,
change there
yeah.
too. But I mean, this is a good point. I mean, like a solution, like really, is this a solution? I mean, what are the aims of Israel to attack like this? I mean, it's really, have they actually achieved anything here, or other than obviously it's shown so that both sides have laid their cards down, and we can see their military performance, but in terms of their aims and what their achievements, I don't. But I don't. It's not quite clear what's been achieved here, and well, what they're aiming to achieve as well. Yeah, you have any thoughts?
Absolutely. No, I
Yeah.
mean, I would say, I mean, from my reading of things in general, I would say this is a kind of standard Israeli strategic way of looking at the world, which is they don't know how to deal with the political situation. They don't want to deal with the political situation, so they find a tactical military solution to the problem. You could say that the occupation of West Bank and Gaza is basically that's all there is to it. There is no political solution that they are willing to entertain. So they have military tactical gains to deal with it, and then they have to redo it 3, 4 years later.
Right.
So from an Israeli point of view, you can say that destroying the program is nothing. I mean, first of all, Israel is by far the most important military power.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there's nothing the Iranians could have in terms of air defense or air or anything that would, match it.
Mm,
But for the Israelis, the only way of not permanently destroying the program, because that's not in the cards really,
mm,
unless you occupy the place, um, is to get the Americans involved.
right.
So Israel can do very good strikes as they've done. They can kill a lot of important people, etc., etc. But when it comes to do the kind of industrial scale destruction, which is required for a program that is on an industrial scale,
Yes.
in the end, they would need to get the Americans involved.
Yeah.
So that's one. Secondly, I think they underestimated the Iranian missile program's ability to penetrate their air defense.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so if you look at what Trump was saying, because there seems to be no filter between him and his social media
Yes.
account. So in the beginning, he was very, bragging about what the Israelis were doing, et cetera, because that was what they were doing.
Yeah.
And then it turns out the Iranian can still strike back and strike back quite well.
Yes.
So from the Israelis underestimated Iranian missile defense, and the Iranians totally underestimated how penetrated their own system was by the
Yeah.
Israelis.
Yeah. Yeah. So both sides were exposed. I mean, that was interesting what you're saying also about the sort of tactical kicking the can down the road from the Israel,
Mm,
which doesn't actually bode very well for future conflict, right? Because it could well mean, I mean, maybe I'm reading between the lines here, but it could well mean there'll be more attacks in the future if they think that that's, well, we don't have a political solution here. We're just going to show our a deterrence effect and show our strength through another attack.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So,
then here, of course, the perverse logic is that having now attacked
yeah.
and knowing full well that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon
Yeah.
means that the incentive for those in Tehran who argue that the nuclear weapon is the only deterrence that will work in the end increases,
Yeah. Yeah.
radically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see many commentators on Twitter X, not that I spend too much time on Twitter X, talking about, well, North Korea hasn't been attacked, or, any, or Pakistan, any nuclear weapon state.
Yeah.
The incentive is very strong. And actually, I just want at one point, because of course, one thing that didn't make the news while that was all happening was hundreds were being killed in Gaza
Yeah.
during the events, and it was just swept under the carpet by the shameful Western media. How does Gaza fit into all this from the Israeli government perspective? Because obviously there's a human tragedy going on, but there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. Is there a political reason why they're in Israel that they're not looking to finish that, or to actually wind down that war? Or I mean, it doesn't seem to be any purpose. Is there any connection between what's happening on in Gaza and?
I
uh,
think there's probably several connections, but the most obvious one to me is that the fact that there has been no consequences for Israel
yeah, yeah,
for what they've done in Gaza.
yeah,
And for that matter, the way that they have, basically destroyed Lebanese sovereignty,
yeah,
occupying part of Lebanon, occupying more parts of Syria, and no one, there
yeah,
is no payment for this.
yeah,
You are not losing anything by doing that. I think told them, look, if we can do all that, and the Europeans and Americans, have our back, then that's
yeah.
another good reason why now is the golden opportunity. We have the military
Right.
supremacy, and we have the political
the
capital.
backing, the
Yeah.
backing from not only the United States. You can somehow sort of guess under Trump that there would be backing, but isn't it incredible that and this is probably a move because I know we've only got 12 minutes left, but
Yeah.
Europeans and
Yes.
normally they have a strong proponent of international law
Yeah.
and conflict resolution and stuff. What is your take on why or how? Well, first of all, how have Western governments reacted, and why have they reacted in such a way? Yeah.
Well, I mean, when it comes to Gaza, one thing that all states do, especially when it comes to friends, is that states have other states back.
Mm.
Okay. And so the first thing the state will do is say sovereignty.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyone, attacks us, then all bets are off because, that is,
yeah,
survival is the ultimate
yeah,
criteria.
sure.
So there's that. But then there is, of course, the fact that Israel has a special relationship with the US, but also with the European Union and the European
Yeah,
countries, more or less, depending on which member state you
yeah,
look at. And so what their instinctive reaction was that, of course, what Hamas did was a terror attack, and therefore Israel needs to respond. But that then kind of morphed into some kind of obnoxiously
yeah,
stubborn unwillingness to acknowledge that this war was not in any shape, sense, or form conducted in a
okay.
way that would have been considered acceptable if anyone else had done it.
Yeah, yeah,
And so not just the Germans, but them and everyone else have kind of dug this hole for themselves where they simply, they end up having to, issue these convoluted
yeah.
Orwellian press
Right,
releases,
right.
which, that
It,
anyone with two, pair of
the,
eyes and any kind of internet connection can tell, can refute in 30 seconds. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I mean, and that applies also to their statements on the attack on Iran recently as well, right? I mean,
yes,
if you try and read the statements, and unfortunately not in the European countries, but also, in New Zealand and Australia, though, and notably, I think in some Asian countries, and including US allies or partners like South Korea and Japan, there's been a bit more condemnation.
yeah,
But the statements on the Israeli attack and the U.S. justification and attack and justification have been very weak, and actually they haven't criticized them at
no,
all, which undermines, doesn't it, international law, the IEA, IAEA, the NPT, and the United Nations itself, doesn't it? Or what are your
absolutely. No, no, absolutely. And I think, Europe
yeah,
to be, if you want to be, sorry, if you want to be kind of very brutal about it, you can say that Europe doesn't have that many things going for it.
yeah,
It is a financial power, but actually its financial institutions are very much wedded to American control.
right,
It's not a military power yet. It will take a decade or so for them to reach that kind of strength that they're now slowly budgeting for. One of the few things that Europe has had was its value-based system, and the fact that, unlike others, fairly consistently, they at least referred to
yeah,
and tried to bring in international law. And with Gaza,
yeah,
very much, and now also with Iran, it's very clear if you listen to member state leadership
yes,
that all of that is optional depending on who it applies to.
right,
And that is, that's the first no-no of any kind of legal system is that,
yeah,
if you're going to pick and choose who it applies to, it's not really much of a system.
yeah. That's right. And I think they're going to struggle now, I think, when they rally support for Ukraine, right? Because effectively, well, again, it's a case of ranked double standards. Macron was just in Singapore 3 weeks ago talking about double standards, and straight away afterwards seems to have it was just talk. And I mean, this issue with language and doublespeak
Mm,
is really a problem nowadays. This Orwellian language, like you said. I know we haven't got much time left. I just wanted two more sort of main
sure.
topics, like what's going on within Iran, and then what's next, like scenarios of how things can play out. So, within Iran itself, I guess, um, from my read of survival of the regime or the government is obviously very important for the regime itself. Do you think that's been strengthened or weakened? That's one question. And then the people of Iran, how are they? Do you think is any way we can actually sense the reaction? I don't think we've got a good read here in these countries of what's actually the sentiment on the ground there. Those 2 points, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, obviously the Islamic Republic
Mm,
wants now to play up any kind of sense of loyalty people have to the country
mm,
and kind of conflate that with loyalty to them.
right,
It's quite clear that the absolute vast majority of Iranians would like to change this system tomorrow
right,
if they had the power to do it.
yeah,
But I think what the Israelis and some of these exile Iranian groups
yeah,
have totally underestimated is just the simple fact that Iranians are, in many senses, very nationalistic.
yes,
And for them, this is now not an attack on the government or the
right,
state, it's an attack on the country.
right,
Uh,
yeah,
and because, the vast majority of those who've been killed in Iran, and we're talking 700 people at least, are civilians.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And also for quite a few people, I would say, they're also worried about what this would mean, because from what they've seen from Lebanon and Syria and from Gaza is, of course, that the Israeli way of waging war doesn't leave anything left behind.
yeah.
It doesn't leave anything.
And
And
then regime change, but given in Iraq and other countries has been an absolute disaster. Exactly, that there's no sort of desire for that, right?
no, and you can see that primarily, for instance, in someone like Reza Pahlavi, who is the pretender to the throne, so to
Yes,
speak, and he has a rather close relationship with the Israeli leadership. And
yes,
so when he was asked, also in Western media, he was challenged, what do you think about these bombings? He basically refused to condemn them. He
right,
refused to, say anything that criticized the way the Israelis were attacking Iran. And the interesting thing was to see how many people who are monarchists,
yes,
and they are by definition very nationalist, who, especially the old guard who used to work with his dad, his
yes,
father, the
right,
last real king,
yeah,
um, they really cut him into pieces.
And they said this is not right.
because this is totally unacceptable. You
Yeah,
cannot get back to the throne of Iran on the wings of Israeli jet
yeah,
fighters, and you cannot claim that you want to represent this country and at the same time embrace a military attack that kills people from a foreign
yeah.
country.
That's right. And it seems like that was one of the aims of Israel, though not the United States. And there's a difference there. What Israel were trying to do some sort of regime change operation. Well, it's hard to read, but like by the way, they attacked that civilian infrastructure as well, and leaders as such, and the words from Israeli leadership, in fact, to that effect.
Yeah.
I'll move on to well, actually, last question on what's going on. Well, maybe this is the last part. Which what next? I think the deterrence, I guess, between Israel and Iran that's lasted for some years has been shattered, right? And I think that's changed. So I wanted to ask about uh, the deterrence, the negotiations going forward. Any thoughts on that? And what do you see as the most likely scenario? And obviously the nuclear program itself going forward.
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. And in a sense, the easy way out is to claim Trump, changes his mind every 5 minutes. So there's
Yeah,
absolutely nothing that I would be able to claim
right.
is
Yeah,
likely or unlikely today. You
yeah,
have to give up on those kind of basic parameters. So I would say this. There can be negotiations. There are indications that there will be negotiations. They will be between Iran and the United States.
right.
And you could say that if what Trump says outwards and what the Iranians are now saying, publicly, is that they are both agreed that the United States did wreck the Iranian nuclear program. Whether that is true or not is actually kind of
They're
besides
both
the
saying
fact.
that. They're
Yes, the
both
Iranians are
sides.
saying that the
Ah,
more
okay.
was destroyed than we thought in the beginning.
Ah,
God knows if it's true or if it is playing
right.
into Donald Trump's
The
ego.
narrative. Yeah, yeah,
They could negotiate. I think they will negotiate. On the one hand, Trump also says that he doesn't need to negotiate because mission has been accomplished. The Iranian program
right,
has been destroyed. So it
right.
depends on how much reality can pierce this bubble of his.
Yes,
Um, the problem with those negotiations are twofold. One, if his public stance on what he has done to the nuclear program is what he actually sincerely believes, then
yeah,
he will expect more concessions from Iran than the Iranians are going to be willing to give.
right, right. Yes,
Okay.
yeah,
So that is a problem inside the negotiations.
yeah.
The other problem is external, which is that the Israelis are not interested in these negotiations at all.
Yes,
And in a sense, they have more agency than either of those two parties.
yes,
Iran is not going to initiate a new war against Israel because they know they would just lose that. There's no
yes,
point for them to do anything
yeah,
like that. The Americans don't want more war because Trump knows that his MAGA base was quite upset with the fact that
yes,
he joined the war to begin with, right? And now he's officially declared that the war is over. It's over. The Israelis are the ones who have the greatest interest in wrecking these negotiations
right,
if they turn out to actually go anywhere,
yes.
because they will not accept, most likely.
And so how would they wreck the negotiations? Would it be another, out of the blue strike? Is that or could it be some other, or was it more internal machinations within the Trump sort of negotiating team
All
or
of the above.
Trump? Yeah, all of the above.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, it's a question of how cocky Netanyahu is going to be, whether he wants to do it to Trump's face, most likely not. But
Yes.
they could, of course, initiate something inside Iran, which the Iranians would then feel that they need to react to.
Yes.
Or a false flag operation, or
Yeah.
basically try and pressure Trump from inside the White House through their friends like Rubio and others who are neoconservative and therefore very much prone to thinking that the Iranian problem can only be solved militarily.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess for international law and non-nuclear non-proliferation, do you think what are the lasting impacts? I mean, especially coming from a country like New Zealand, which has had a strong anti-nuclear stance and obviously protested and has a law against nuclear weapons coming into our waters or territory. What we're obviously interested in non-nuclear proliferation. What do you think is the longer term impact on non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation
Well,
from?
I mean, I think in a sense, that depends on what the last chapter in this sordid book is going to look like.
Yeah,
If they reach an agreement which reinstates IAEA surveillance and at the same time gives Iran the incentives it needs to stick to that deal, And
Yes.
if the Americans then also manage to stick to that deal, Trump actually signed something worthwhile reading, then you
Yes.
can say that it's a Hail Mary pass for non-proliferation attempts in
Right.
the world.
Yeah.
If they don't, I'm afraid more countries than not are going to draw the conclusion that in a world where international law is whatever a German chancellor wants it to be at any given moment in time,
Yes. Well,
and no matter how much you pay Donald Trump, he might or might not defend you or actually decide to attack you, then nuclear weapon is probably the only deterrence that is left.
that is left. Yeah. And does it and I guess the thought there then just the ideas or values of the so-called ideas of around international law just get weaker so that small countries and Western countries get their soft power is diminished. No, overall, I mean,
Mm.
the
Yep,
global south or other the rising countries, if we look at the world today, it's changing the whole time. And in relative terms, the rest of the world is looking and saying, what hypocrites and double standards you have, and we're just not going to listen to you anymore. Do you think that's a fair point that this is just going to increase? Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the trend was already there, but I think Donald Trump accelerated the US relative decline through his
Yeah.
behavior from his first presidency and now. And the
Yeah.
Europeans have kind of accelerated their own relevance for that kind of international discourse by being, I mean, there is hypocrisy in the international system at any given point
Yes.
in time. That's nothing, it's not
Yeah.
shocking in itself. It's the sheer size of this hypocrisy and the fact that they're trying to put lipstick on this pig and claim it's a cat. It's
Yeah.
not. It's
It's
still
not.
a pig.
And and in Asia and China and places like that, well, I mean, there's a good claim to be made that there's more stability over there or more sort of rules adherence to rules
Mm.
over there than here, right?
Yeah.
Well, with that, I know we're at time. Thank you
Mm.
very much for your
Thank
insight.
you. My
It's
pleasure.
really really great. It's always a pleasure to have you on our Diplo Stack podcast.